The mountain air cut through Catherine Mitchell's lungs like shattered glass as she collapsed beside the ancient stone well, her swollen belly pressing against the cold earth that seemed to leach the last warmth from her failing body. Her vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in like ink spreading through water, as her trembling hands reached desperately for the wooden bucket that might as well have been a mile away. The rope was frayed from years of use, the wood worn smooth by countless hands that had drawn life from these depths before her. The baby inside her kicked weakly, a fluttering movement that spoke of diminishing strength, as if sensing her desperation and the approaching shadow of death that had followed them up this treacherous mountain path. She whispered a prayer into the wind that had become her only companion in these desolate peaks, her voice barely audible above the constant whistle of air through stone and pine. "Please," she breathed, her words lost in the vastness of the wilderness. "Not my baby. Take me, but let my child live." She had been walking for 3 days now, her worn boots leaving bloody prints on the rocky trail, following rumors of a hermit who lived somewhere in these mountains, a man who might show mercy to a woman with nowhere else to turn. The stories varied depending on who told them. Some said he was a madman, driven insane by isolation. Others whispered that he was a saint, a man who had chosen solitude to better serve God's will. Catherine had chosen to believe the latter, because hope was all she had left to sustain her. Her husband had cast her out when the pregnancy began to show, claiming the child wasn't his, though they both knew the truth of his cruelty ran deeper than doubt. Thomas Mitchell was a man who measured his worth by the fear he could instill in others, who found in his pregnant wife a convenient target for rage that had nothing to do with fidelity and everything to do with his own failures as a human being. "Get out," he had said, his voice cold as January wind. "Take your bastard and get out of my house. If I see you in town again, I'll have you arrested for adultery." The townspeople had turned their backs when she'd begged for work, for shelter, for anything that might keep her and her unborn child alive. Women who had once smiled and nodded at church services now crossed the street to avoid her, their righteousness a shield against the uncomfortable truth that any of them could find themselves in her position if their own husbands decided to discard them. Mrs. Henderson, who had delivered half the babies in town, had refused to even look at Catherine when she'd knocked on her door. "I don't help whores," she had said, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The word had followed Catherine through the streets like a physical presence, whispered behind hands, shouted from doorways, carved into her soul with the precision of a blade. Now, as consciousness slipped away from her like water through cupped hands, Catherine wondered if she would die here beside this well, if her baby would never draw breath in this harsh world. The irony wasn't lost on her that she might perish from thirst mere feet from water, too weak to lift the bucket, too proud to have asked for help when it might have mattered. The sound of heavy boots on stone barely registered in her fading awareness, like thunder from a distant storm. A shadow fell across her face, blocking the pale afternoon sun, and she felt herself being lifted with surprising gentleness. Strong arms cradled her against a chest that smelled of pine smoke and honest sweat, of leather and wood shavings, and something indefinably clean that spoke of a man who lived close to the earth. She heard a voice, deep and rough from disuse, speaking words she couldn't quite grasp through the fog that was settling over her mind. "Easy now," the voice said. "I've got you. You're safe." Safe! The word seemed foreign, a concept she had almost forgotten existed. When had she last felt safe? Before the pregnancy? Certainly. Before Thomas had revealed his true nature. Perhaps not even then, if she was honest with herself. Safety was a luxury she had never been able to afford. When she woke, she was lying on a simple wooden bed in a cabin that seemed carved from the mountain itself, every log fitted with the precision of a master craftsman. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with hand-hewn shelves that held books, tools, and mason jars filled with preserved foods. The man sitting in the corner chair was studying her with eyes the color of storm clouds, his weathered face unreadable beneath a beard streaked with premature gray. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 35, with the kind of lean strength that came from years of physical labor. His hands, she noticed, were scarred but clean, the nails trimmed short, the fingers long and capable. There was something about his posture that spoke of military training, a way of holding himself that suggested he was always ready to move, to act, to defend. "The water," she whispered, her throat raw and aching as if she had been screaming. He rose without a word, moving with economical grace to fill a tin cup from a pitcher on the rough table. The pitcher was beautiful in its simplicity, clearly handmade, with a glaze the color of autumn leaves. He brought it to her lips, supporting her head with one hand while she drank. The water was cold and sweet, better than any wine she had ever tasted, carrying the mineral taste of deep springs and ancient stone. She drank greedily until he gently pulled the cup away, his touch careful, respectful. "Slowly," he said, his voice carrying the weight of solitude, of words saved up and carefully chosen. "You've been unconscious for 2 days. Your body needs time to remember how to live." 2 days. Catherine's hand moved instinctively to her belly, relief flooding through her when she felt the baby's movement, stronger now than it had been beside the well. "My child?" "Still fighting," he said, returning to his chair with the same measured movements. "Like its mother, I'd guess. You walked 3 days up this mountain in your condition. That takes more than desperation. That takes courage." She studied his face in the firelight, searching for judgment or disgust, the expressions she had grown accustomed to seeing in every mirror, every shop window, every face that looked her way. Instead, she found only a quiet watchfulness, as if he were waiting for her to decide who she wanted to be in this moment. "I'm Catherine Mitchell," she said finally, the name feeling strange on her tongue. She had been called so many other things in recent months. Whore, adulteress, burden, mistake, that her actual name seemed like something borrowed from someone else's life. "Stephen Rogers." He gestured toward the cabin around them with a hand that bore old scars, white lines across the knuckles that spoke of fights survived and lessons learned the hard way. "This is my home. You're welcome to stay until you're strong enough to travel." The simple kindness in his words nearly broke her. She had expected nothing, hoped for little more than a quick death if her body finally gave out. And here was a stranger offering shelter without question or condition. The generosity felt almost too large to accept, like trying to hold the ocean in her cupped palms. "I can't pay you," she said, the admission burning in her throat like acid. "I have nothing to offer in return." Stephen's expression didn't change, but she caught something in his eyes that might have been understanding, or recognition, or simply the patience of a man who had learned not to judge others by their circumstances. "Did I ask for payment?" She shook her head, tears threatening to spill over. In the silence that followed, she heard the wind whistling through the peaks outside, the snap and hiss of the fire, and beneath it all, the steady rhythm of her own heart still beating despite everything that had tried to stop it. "The well," she said, "is it yours?" "It's whoever needs it most," Stephen replied. And something in his tone suggested this was more than philosophy, that he had learned this truth through experience rather than reflection. Water doesn't belong to any one person. Neither does mercy. Something in his words, in the way he said them with such quiet conviction, suggested that he had been on both sides of mercy, had given it and received it, had learned its value through scarcity. Catherine closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel safe for the first time in months, though she knew such feelings were dangerous luxuries for someone in her position. The cabin was warm, warmer than any place she had been in months. The bed was fine, the blankets clean and well mended. Through the single window, she could see snow-capped peaks that stretched to the horizon, beautiful and terrible in their majesty. This was a place removed from the world, a sanctuary where different rules might apply. "How long have you been alone up here?" she asked. "7 years," Stephen said, adding another log to the fire. The wood was well seasoned, cut to perfect lengths, stacked with military precision. "Since I left the army." "By choice?" His smile was bitter as winter wind. "That's a matter of perspective." When she woke again, pale sunlight was streaming through the single window, and the cabin was empty except for the lingering scent of coffee and bacon. Her stomach clenched with hunger so fierce it made her dizzy, and she realized she couldn't remember the last time she had eaten a full meal. The baby inside her seemed to sense the possibility of nourishment, moving with more energy than she had felt in days. On the table beside the bed sat a plate covered with a clean cloth, and beneath it she found thick slices of bread that was still warm from the oven, strips of bacon cooked to perfect crispness, and eggs that were golden and fresh. There was also a small jar of honey, its amber contents catching the morning light like liquid gold. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, marveling at how something as simple as food could feel like a miracle. The bread was dense and hearty, made from flour that had been ground with care. The bacon was lean and flavorful, from an animal that had been well tended. Even the eggs tasted different here, richer somehow, as if the chickens that laid them lived better lives than the people in town. Through the window, she could see Stephen working in what appeared to be a garden, his movements economical and sure as he tended to rows of vegetables that somehow thrived in this harsh altitude. He had removed his shirt in the warming sun, and she could see the play of muscles across his back, the easy strength that came from years of honest labor. There were scars there too, she noticed, old wounds that had healed white and smooth, telling stories of violence survived and battles won. Whatever had driven him to this mountain, it hadn't been cowardice. This was a man who had faced danger and emerged changed but not broken. When he returned, she was sitting up in bed, the empty plate balanced on her knees. She had braided her hair and washed her face with water from the pitcher, small acts of self-care that felt like reclaiming pieces of herself. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than she had ever meant anything. He nodded, taking the plate without comment, but she caught the slight softening around his eyes that might have been satisfaction or relief or simply pleasure at seeing color return to her cheeks. "How long have you lived here?" she asked. 7 years. He moved to the fireplace, adding wood to the coals with practiced efficiency. "Built this place with my own hands, log by log, stone by stone. 7 years of solitude in these mountains." Catherine tried to imagine what could drive a man to such isolation. What wounds might require such distance from the world to heal? She had her own reasons for fleeing civilization, but his seemed deeper, more permanent, chosen rather than forced upon him. "Waya," the question slipped out before she could stop it. Stephen was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain, carefully contained but never fully healed. "Sometimes the world gets too small for the mistakes you've made," he said. "Sometimes the only way to live with yourself is to go somewhere where you can't hurt anyone else." She understood that feeling, the sense that your failures had poisoned every familiar place, made every face a mirror reflecting your shame. Her own exile had been forced upon her, but she recognized the voluntary nature of his, the choice to disappear rather than face whatever judgment awaited him below. "What will you do?" he asked, turning the conversation away from his own pain with the skill of someone who had learned to deflect unwanted sympathy. "When you're stronger." The question she had been avoiding crashed over her like a cold wave. What would she do? She had no money, no family willing to take her in, no skills that would earn her honest work in her condition. The baby would come whether she was ready or not, and then what? How did a woman alone raise a child in a world that had already declared them both unwanted? "I don't know," she admitted, the words feeling like defeat on her tongue. Stephen studied her face with those storm-colored eyes, and she had the unsettling feeling he could see straight through to her fears, her desperate calculations, her growing certainty that she had simply traded one form of death for another. "Winter comes early here," he said carefully, "stays late. The road down the mountain becomes impassable for months at a time." The implication hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. If she stayed much longer, she would be trapped here until spring, her baby likely born in this remote cabin with only Stephen Rogers for help. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, she felt something that might have been relief. "I wouldn't want to be a burden," she said carefully, testing the waters of his offer. "Burden's a choice," Stephen replied, his voice steady and sure. "So's help, so's family, if it comes to that." Family. The word hit her like a physical blow, carrying implications she wasn't ready to examine. But there was something in the way he said it, matter of fact and without expectation, that made her think he understood exactly what he was offering and what it might cost them both. That afternoon, he showed her around the small homestead he had carved from the wilderness. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from inside, with a second room that served as both workshop and storage. His craftsmanship was evident everywhere, from the perfectly fitted joints in the log walls to the ingenious system of gutters that collected rainwater in wooden barrels. "You did all this work yourself?" Catherine asked, running her fingers along the smooth surface of a windowsill that had been sanded to silk. "Had to learn as I went," Stephen said, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Made plenty of mistakes along the way." She could see evidence of those mistakes in the places where repairs had been made, where trial and error had taught him better methods. A section of wall where the chinking had been redone, a door frame that had been adjusted to hang properly, a chimney that showed signs of being rebuilt from the ground up. But the overall effect was one of quiet competence, a man who had found purpose in the act of creation, in building something lasting from the raw materials of the wilderness. Every surface showed the marks of careful attention, of time taken to do things right rather than fast. The garden was a marvel of mountain agriculture, protected from wind by carefully placed stones and planted with hardy varieties that could survive the short growing season. He had built terraces into the slope, maximizing the available soil. And a small greenhouse constructed from salvaged windows extended the growing period for more delicate plants. "Tomatoes," Stephen said, pointing to plants heavy with red fruit. "Shouldn't be able to grow them this high, but the greenhouse gives them just enough warmth." There were potatoes and carrots, beans climbing wooden poles, herbs that filled the air with their fragrance. A small orchard of apple trees, still young but showing promise. Beehives that hummed with activity, their inhabitants working among flowers that had been planted specifically for their benefit. "You've built Eden up here," Catherine said, wonder in her voice. "Just a place to live," Stephen replied, but she could see the pride in his eyes, the satisfaction of a man who had created something beautiful from nothing. The well stood at the center of it all, its stone sides worn smooth by weather and use. The water that had saved her life bubbled up from some deep spring, clear and cold, even in the heat of summer. Someone had carved words into the stone rim, worn almost smooth by time and weather. "What does it say?" Catherine asked, tracing the faded letters with her finger. Stephen knelt beside her, his hand covering hers as he guided her fingers along the inscription. "Whosoever drinketh of this water shall never thirst," he said quietly. The biblical reference wasn't lost on her, but there was something more personal in the way he said it, as if the words held meaning beyond their scriptural context. "Did you carve this?" "No," Stephen said. "It was here when I arrived. One of the reasons I chose this spot. The water's yours now," he added, echoing the words he had spoken when he first found her. "Long as you need it." As the days passed, Catherine felt her strength returning, along with something she had thought lost forever. Hope. Stephen asked nothing of her except that she rest and eat, but she found herself helping where she could, preparing meals, mending clothes, tending the fire. The work felt good after months of helplessness, and she began to remember who she had been before shame and desperation had worn her down to nothing. "You don't have to do that," Stephen said, finding her one morning scrubbing his shirts in a wooden tub behind the cabin. "I want to," Catherine replied, wringing out a shirt with more force than necessary. "I need to feel useful." Stephen watched her work for a moment, taking in the determined set of her shoulders, the way she attacked the task as if she were fighting something larger than stains and dirt. "You've been useful since the day you arrived," he said quietly. "This place has felt more like a home with you in it." The words caught her off guard, and she looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken, a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Stephen was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He brought her books from his small collection, classics that had somehow survived his exile from civilization. Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe, Jane Eyre. Stories of people who had found strength in isolation, who had discovered that the wilderness could teach lessons that civilization never could. He carved a chair that better supported her growing belly, adjusting the angle of the back until it was perfect, adding cushions stuffed with soft pine needles and covered with fabric he had somehow acquired. When she mentioned craving apples, he disappeared for an entire day and returned with a sack of fruit from some distant orchard, his boots worn thin from walking. "How far did you go?" Catherine asked, biting into an apple that was crisp and sweet and everything she had been dreaming of. "Far enough," Stephen said, but she could see the exhaustion in his face, the way he favored his left leg as if he had pushed himself beyond reasonable limits. She learned his story in fragments, pieces offered in quiet moments when the walls between them grew thin. He had been a soldier once, had served in campaigns that left scars on his soul deeper than any physical wound. The details remained hazy, but she gathered there had been a choice, a moment when doing what was right had cost him everything he thought he valued. "The army doesn't forgive certain kinds of conscience," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, his hands busy whittling a piece of pine. "What did you do?" Stephen's knife paused in its work, and for a moment Catherine thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but she could hear the old pain beneath it. "Refused an order that would have gotten good men killed for a bad cause," he said. "My commanding officer wanted to attack a position that was too well defended, send my men into a slaughter just so he could claim a victory for his record. So you said no." "I said no." Stephen's hands resumed their work, shaping what Catherine now recognized as a cradle rocker. "Turned out being right doesn't matter much when you're also insubordinate." Catherine watched the wood take shape under his knife, recognizing the love and care that went into every curve, every smooth surface. The sight made her throat tight with emotion she couldn't name. "Do you regret it?" Stephen looked up from his work, meeting her eyes across the firelight. In his gaze, she saw the weight of command, the burden of decisions that had cost lives no matter which way he chose. "I regret the men who died because I wasn't there to lead them better," he said. "I don't regret the ones who lived because I wouldn't send them into hell for glory." She understood then why he had chosen this isolation, why a man who clearly possessed both skill and intelligence had retreated to these mountains. Some principles could only be preserved in solitude. Some truths only honored far from the compromises that civilization demanded. Her own story came out more slowly, the shame of it harder to bear than his quiet acceptance made necessary. She told him about her marriage to a man who had seemed kind until kindness became inconvenient, about the pregnancy that had revealed his true nature, about the town that had watched her fall and done nothing to break it. "Thomas was different when we were courting," she said one night, staring into the fire as if she could see her past in the flames. "He brought me flowers, wrote me letters, told me I was beautiful." "What changed?" Stephen asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I did," Catherine said bitterly. "I stopped being the perfect woman he thought he was marrying and became a real person with real needs and real opinions." She told him about the first time Thomas had struck her, the shock of it, the way he had apologized afterward and sworn it would never happen again, about how the apologies had grown shorter and less frequent, how the violence had become routine, expected, almost comforting in its predictability. "When I told him about the baby, he accused me of adultery," Catherine continued. "Said I was a whore, that the child couldn't be his because he was a godly man who would never father a bastard." "But you know the truth," Stephen said, and it wasn't a question. "I know the truth," Catherine confirmed, "but truth doesn't matter when everyone wants to believe the lie." Stephen set down his carving and moved to sit beside her on the rough wooden bench he had built in front of the fireplace. He didn't touch her, didn't offer empty comfort, but his presence was steady and warm and somehow made the telling easier. "They said I was a whore," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. "Said the baby couldn't be his because he was a godly man." "What do you say?" Stephen asked. The question surprised her. No one had asked what she believed, what truth she carried in her own heart. Everyone had been so eager to judge, to condemn, to cast stones that no one had bothered to ask for her side of the story. "I say a godly man doesn't throw his pregnant wife into the street," she replied, feeling strength return to her voice. "I say a godly man doesn't let fear make him cruel." Stephen nodded as if this settled the matter completely. His faith in her version of events, offered without question or condition, began to heal something in Catherine that she hadn't realized was broken. "I say," she continued, the words coming stronger now, "that any man who would abandon his child is no man at all, godly or otherwise. Then we're in agreement, Stephen said simply. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of fire, Catherine's belly grew round and heavy. The baby moved constantly now, as if eager to enter the world, and she found herself talking to it during the long afternoons when Stephen was working outside. "You're going to be born free," she would whisper, her hands tracing circles on her stretched skin. "No one's going to tell you who you are or what you're worth. You're going to know your own strength from the very beginning." Stephen had finished the cradle, a masterpiece of joinery that rocked smooth and silent on curved runners. He had also been quietly preparing for the birth, consulting medical books he had somehow acquired, gathering supplies, even practicing with clean cloths and hot water until Catherine was convinced he knew more about midwifery than most women. "You've done this before," she said, watching him arrange instruments with surgical precision. "No," Stephen replied, "but I've seen what happens when you're not prepared for the worst." The worst. Catherine tried not to think about all the ways childbirth could go wrong, especially here in the mountains, miles from any doctor or midwife. But she found she trusted Stephen's careful preparations more than she would have trusted the finest physician. He had kept her alive when she was dying beside his well. She believed he would see her through whatever came next. "I'm not afraid," she said one evening, and realized with surprise that it was true. Stephen looked up from the medical text he was studying, candlelight flickering across his weathered features. "No, I'm not afraid of the birth," Catherine clarified. "I'm not afraid of the pain or the danger or any of it. For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid." What changed? Catherine considered the question, looking around the cabin that had become her sanctuary, at the man who had become her protector, her partner, her friend, and perhaps something more. "I realize I'm not alone," she said. "Whatever happens, I'm not facing it alone." Stephen's smile was soft and warm, and when he reached across the space between them to take her hand, Catherine felt something settle into place in her chest. A piece of herself she hadn't known was missing. The first snow came early that year, dusting the peaks with white while the valleys still blazed with autumn color. Catherine stood at the cabin window, watching the flakes drift down like scattered prayers, and realized she was no longer thinking about leaving. The outside world had become abstract, a place that existed in memory rather than possibility. "The road will be closed soon," Stephen said, joining her at the window. His breath fogged the glass as he spoke, and Catherine found herself studying his reflection, the strong profile, the way his hair had grown longer during their time together. "I know. You could still make it down before the heavy snows," he continued, but there was something in his voice that suggested he didn't want her to go. Catherine turned to study his face directly, searching for clues to what he was really thinking. "Do you want me to go?" The question hung between them like the snow hung in the air, delicate and transformative. When Stephen looked at her, she saw something in his expression that made her heart beat faster. Longing, hope, and something deeper that neither of them had been brave enough to name. "No," he said simply, "I want you to stay." The admission seemed to surprise them both. They had been circling around their growing connection for weeks, neither willing to name what was happening between them. Now, with winter closing in and the baby due any day, pretense had become impossible. "I don't know what I can offer you," Catherine said, her hand moving instinctively to her swollen belly. "I'm not even sure who I am anymore." "You're the woman who walked 3 days through mountains to save her child," Stephen replied, moving closer until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "You're the woman who chose to fight when the world told you to surrender. That's enough for me." His words wrapped around her like warmth, like safety, like the promise of belonging somewhere. She had spent so many months believing herself worthless, accepting the judgment of people who had never faced her choices, that she had forgotten her own courage. "And you?" she asked, reaching up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his beard beneath her palm. "What are you offering?" Stephen was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the snow beyond the window. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had learned the value of promises the hard way. "A place to belong," he said finally, "a chance to build something new from the pieces of what we used to be." "Is that enough?" Catherine asked. For you, I mean. A broken woman and a bastard child? Stephen's hands came up to cover hers, his touch gentle but sure. You're not broken, he said firmly. You're healing. There's a difference. That night, as the wind howled through the peaks and snow began to pile against the cabin walls, Catherine felt the first contractions. They were gentle at first, barely distinguishable from the aches and pains that had become constant companions. But as the hours passed, they grew stronger, more insistent, until she could no longer pretend this was anything other than the beginning of the end. Stephen moved with calm efficiency, lighting extra candles, heating water, arranging the supplies he had so carefully gathered. His steady presence anchored her as the pain built and receded in waves, each one bringing her child closer to the world. Tell me about the water, she gasped between contractions, needing something to focus on besides the growing intensity of her labor. What about it? Why did you say it was mine? Stephen paused in his preparations, considering the question while he checked the temperature of the water he was heating. Because you needed it more than anyone else in that moment, he said. Because need creates ownership more than money or law ever could. Another contraction seized her, stronger than the rest, and she gripped the sides of the bed until her knuckles went white. When it passed, she found Stephen beside her, his hand cool on her fevered brow, his presence solid and reassuring. I'm scared, she admitted, the words torn from her throat by another wave of pain. Fear's just another kind of strength, he said, his voice steady and sure. It means you have something worth protecting. What if something goes wrong, Catherine asked, voicing the fear that had been growing alongside her baby. What if I die? What if the baby dies? Stephen's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in a grip that spoke of unshakable determination. Then we'll face it together, he said, but I won't let that happen. I've lost too much already to lose you now. The labor continued through the night, snow piling higher against the windows, while Catherine fought the most important battle of her life. Stephen never left her side, offering water when she could drink it, cool cloths when the fever took her, steady words when the pain threatened to break her resolve. You're doing beautifully, he murmured, during a brief respite between contractions. You're the strongest woman I've ever known. I don't feel strong, Catherine panted. I feel like I'm being torn apart. That's what strength looks like sometimes, Stephen said. Not the absence of pain, but the decision to keep going despite it. As dawn approached, the contractions grew closer together, more intense, until Catherine felt as if she were drowning in waves of sensation that threatened to sweep her away entirely. But Stephen's voice kept calling her back, kept anchoring her to the present moment, to the task at hand. I can see the head, he said, his voice tight with excitement and concentration. Just a little more, Catherine. You're almost there. Dawn was breaking gray and cold when Catherine's daughter finally entered the world, her cries echoing off the cabin walls like a declaration of war against everything that had tried to prevent her existence. Stephen caught the baby with practiced hands, clearing her airways, checking her breathing, before placing her on Catherine's chest. She's perfect, Catherine whispered, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the tiny red face, the perfect fingers that gripped her thumb with surprising strength. She's absolutely perfect. She's a fighter, Stephen agreed, cleaning up with the same methodical care he brought to everything. Like her mother. Catherine studied her daughter's face, searching for resemblances, for signs of the future that awaited them both. The baby had her own dark hair, still damp from birth, her own stubborn chin that spoke of determination even in sleep. But her eyes, when they opened, were the clear gray of mountain storms, the same color as Stephen's. What will you call her, or? Stephen asked, settling into the chair beside the bed, his own face showing the exhaustion of the long night. Catherine had thought about names for months, had considered honoring dead relatives or choosing something that sounded respectable and proper. But looking at her daughter now, born in a cabin carved from wilderness, delivered by a man who had chosen exile over compromise, she knew there was only one name that fit. Hope, she said. Her name is Hope. Stephen's smile was radiant, transforming his weathered features into something beautiful. Hope Rogers, he said, and Catherine's heart skipped a beat at the implication. Rogers? If you'll have us, Stephen said quietly. Both of you, I know it's not conventional, and I know you have every reason not to trust another man's promises. But Catherine silenced him with a kiss, leaning across the space between them to press her lips to his. It was their first kiss, soft and tentative and full of promise, and when they broke apart, she saw her own wonder reflected in his storm-gray eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. The winter that followed was the hardest in memory, with snow that fell for days without stopping and temperatures that cracked trees like gunshots. But inside the cabin, warmth prevailed. Catherine recovered her strength while Stephen tended both mother and child with a devotion that spoke of deep wells of gentleness beneath his weathered exterior. Hope proved to be everything her name suggested, a bright presence that transformed the cabin from a refuge into a home. She rarely cried, seemed content to watch the world with those storm-gray eyes, and grew stronger with each passing day. Catherine had worried about feeding her, about having enough milk in her own weakened state, but Stephen supplemented their diet with game and preserved vegetables until her body responded to her daughter's needs. She likes you, Catherine observed one afternoon, watching Stephen hold Hope while she slept. The baby had curled her tiny fist around his finger, and his expression was one of pure wonder. She's easy to like, he replied, his voice soft with amazement. I never imagined I could feel this way about a child. Catherine had been watching the way he looked at her daughter, the careful way he supported her head, the gentle words he spoke when he thought no one was listening. This man who had chosen solitude was learning to love again, and the sight of it made her heart ache with possibility. You're a natural father, she said. Stephen looked up at her, something vulnerable in his expression. I want to be, he said. I am want to be everything she needs, everything you both need. You already are. As the weeks passed, they settled into routines that felt as natural as breathing. Stephen would rise before dawn to tend the fire and check on the animals he kept in a small shed behind the cabin. Chickens that somehow survived the mountain winter, a cow that provided milk, a horse that could navigate the treacherous trails when necessary. Catherine would feed Hope and prepare breakfast, moving carefully in the space they now shared. The cabin had felt spacious when she was alone in it, but with three of them, it required a different kind of navigation, a dance of domestic intimacy that spoke of growing comfort with each other's presence. Evenings were spent by the fire, Stephen reading aloud while Catherine mended clothes or simply held her daughter, all of them content in the warm circle of lamplight. He had a good voice for reading, deep and expressive, and Hope seemed to enjoy the sound of it, often falling asleep to the rhythm of whatever story he was sharing. She knows your voice, Catherine said one night, watching Hope's peaceful face as Stephen read from Robinson Crusoe. Good, Stephen replied. I want her to always know she's safe when she hears it. They didn't speak of the future, of what would happen when spring came and the roads opened again. The outside world seemed as distant as a half-remembered dream, and Catherine found herself hoping it would stay that way forever. But the world had a way of intruding, even in the most remote places. The first sign of trouble came with the February thaw, when a rider appeared at their door like a harbinger of everything Catherine had tried to escape. She recognized him immediately despite the months that had passed. Deputy Marshal Paul Cook, her husband's cousin, a man who had always looked at her with barely concealed contempt. Catherine Mitchell, he said, not bothering to dismount from his horse. His voice carried across the yard like a challenge, and Catherine felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. Catherine stepped outside, pulling her shawl tight against the cold wind, acutely aware of Stephen moving to stand beside her. Hope was sleeping in the cabin, and Catherine prayed she would stay that way. Marshal Cook, she said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Paul Cook was a tall man with pale eyes and a weak chin hidden behind a carefully groomed beard. He wore his badge like a weapon, always making sure it caught the light, always reminding people of the authority he represented. Catherine had never liked him, even before he had made it clear that he considered her beneath his notice. Your husband's been worried sick, Paul said, his tone suggesting anything but concern. Sent me to bring you home where you belong. This is my home now, Catherine replied, and was surprised by the strength in her own voice. Paul's gaze shifted to Stephen, taking in the mountain man's weathered appearance. The way he stood protectively close to Catherine, the rifle that was never far from his reach. "And who might you be?" "Stephen Rogers," Stephen replied, his voice carrying quiet authority. "This is my land." "Harboring a runaway wife is a serious matter, Rogers," Paul said, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Could be seen as kidnapping, depending on how you look at it." "Could be seen as offering shelter to someone in need," Stephen countered, his own hand moving to rest on the handle of the axe he had been using to split wood. "Depending on how you look at it." The two men stared at each other across the snowy yard, and Catherine felt the tension building like pressure before a storm. She knew Paul Cook, knew the kind of man who wore a badge, like a license for cruelty, who saw law as something to be twisted to serve his own purposes. "The baby," Paul said, his attention returning to Catherine. "Your husband wants to see his child." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that Thomas would simply let her go, that he would be content to be rid of her and the child he claimed wasn't his. "He threw me out," Catherine said, anger flaring despite her fear. "He said the child wasn't his, called me a whore, told me to take my bastard and disappear." "Man's allowed to change his mind about his own family," Paul said with a shrug that suggested he found the whole situation distasteful but necessary. But Catherine could see the lie in Paul's eyes, could read the real purpose behind his visit. Her husband didn't want her back out of love or regret. He wanted to control the narrative, to bring her home where he could continue to punish her for imagined sins while playing the role of the forgiving Christian husband. "I won't go," she said, and the words carried more conviction than she had felt in months. Paul's hand moved to rest on the butt of his pistol, a gesture that was meant to seem casual, but carried unmistakable threat. "Now, Catherine, you don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. You're still a married woman, and married women belong with their husbands." Stephen stepped forward, placing himself between Catherine and the mounted deputy. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, and Paul's eyes narrowed with recognition of the challenge. "The lady's made her choice," Stephen said. "I'd respect that if I were you." "You would you?" Paul's voice took on a mocking tone. "And what makes you think you have any say in legal matters, mountain man?" "Same thing that makes you think you do, I'd guess," Stephen replied. And Catherine heard something in his voice that she hadn't heard before. The authority of a man who had commanded others, who had faced down challenges from men far more dangerous than Paul Cook. Paul seemed to sense it too, because his posture shifted slightly, became more wary. "I'll be back," he said finally, wheeling at his horse around. "With papers, if I have to. Don't make me bring a posse up here, Catherine. It won't go well for anyone." They watched him ride away until he disappeared into the trees, but the threat lingered in the air like smoke. Catherine found herself shaking, not from cold, but from the return of fears she had thought buried. "He'll be back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Stephen replied, his arm coming around her shoulders in a gesture of comfort and protection. Stephen's calm acceptance of the danger should have been reassuring, but Catherine could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he was already planning for what might come next. "I could leave," Catherine said as they walked back toward the cabin. "Take Hope and find somewhere else to go." Stephen stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. "Where?" he asked. "How far do you think you'd get with a baby in winter? And even if you made it somewhere safe, how long before he found you again?" She knew he was right. Even if the roads were passable, which they weren't, she had no money, no destination, no resources to sustain herself and Hope. Running would only delay the inevitable while putting her daughter at risk. "What about you?" she asked. "This is your home." "I won't let my problems drive you away from it." Stephen's expression softened, and he reached up to cup her face in his hands. "Catherine," he said quietly, "you and Hope aren't my problems. You're my family, and I don't run from family." That night, after Hope had been fed and settled in her cradle, Catherine and Stephen sat by the fire discussing their options. None of them were good. "I could leave," Catherine said again, though the words felt like poison on her tongue. "Take Hope and find somewhere else to go." "Where?" Stephen asked, looking up from the piece of wood he was carving. "Another toy for Hope, a small horse with a flowing mane? How far do you think you'd get with a baby in winter?" She knew he was right. Even if the roads were passable, which they weren't, she had no money, no destination, no resources to sustain herself in hope. Running would only delay the inevitable while putting her daughter at risk. "What about you?" she asked. "This is your home. I won't let my problems drive you away from it." Stephen looked up from his carving, and Catherine saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. Determination, resolve, and something deeper that spoke of battles fought and principles defended. "7 years ago," he said slowly, "I walked away from a fight because I thought I was protecting something. Turned out all I was protecting was my own conscience." "Stephen, I won't make that mistake again," he said, his voice carrying the weight of old regrets and new resolve. The weight of his words settled between them like a promise, and Catherine felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of what was being offered and what it might cost them both. "He's not just my husband's cousin," she said. "Paul Cook has friends in the territorial government, connections that reach further than this mountain. If you stand against him, then I stand against him," Stephen said simply. Stephen set down his carving and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered peaks that had been his sanctuary for so long. Catherine watched him, seeing the soldier he had once been in the straightness of his shoulders, the way he assessed the terrain with tactical eyes. "There's something you should know," he said without turning around, "about why I really came here." Catherine waited, sensing that whatever he was about to tell her would change everything between them. "I killed a man," Stephen said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of old pain. "An officer who was selling supplies meant for my men, letting them starve while he got rich. When I confronted him, he drew on me." Stephen's reflection in the window was ghostly, insubstantial, but his voice was solid, real, carrying the conviction of a man who had made peace with his choices. "The army called it murder," he continued, "said I should have gone through proper channels, filed reports, waited for justice that would never come while good men died of hunger." The confession hung in the air between them, and Catherine felt her understanding of Stephen Rogers shift and settle into a new configuration. Not just a conscientious objector, but a man who had chosen justice over law, who had paid the price for doing what was right instead of what was safe. "Do you regret it?" she asked, echoing his earlier question to Gerardo. Stephen turned from the window to meet her eyes, and in his gaze she saw the weight of command, the burden of decisions that had cost lives no matter which way he chose. "I regret that it came to that," Stephen said. "I regret that a man died because he chose greed over honor. But I don't regret that he couldn't hurt anyone else." Catherine rose from her chair and moved to stand beside him at the window. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white that would soon be marked by the passage of men with badges and guns. "Then we stand together," she said, her hand finding his. Stephen turned to look at her, and in his storm-gray eyes she saw surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. "You understand what that means?" he asked. "I understand that running hasn't gotten me anywhere," Catherine replied. "I understand that my daughter deserves better than a mother who's always afraid." That night they made plans with the methodical care of people who knew their lives depended on getting the details right. Stephen had advantages that Paul Cook couldn't know about. Knowledge of every trail and hiding place in these mountains. Skills learned in war that translated well to this kind of conflict. And most importantly, the moral certainty that came from protecting something worth dying for. "The cabin's defensible," Stephen said, sketching the layout on a piece of paper. "Good fields of fire, solid construction, only two approaches that don't leave you completely exposed." Catherine studied the rough map, seeing their home through military eyes for the first time. "You planned for this when you built it." "I planned for the possibility," Stephen confirmed. "A man doesn't live 7 years in exile without making some enemies." They discussed ammunition, food stores, water supplies, all the practical considerations of a siege. Stephen had been preparing for conflict without realizing it, his military training expressing itself in the careful way he had chosen his location, built his defenses, stockpiled supplies. "What about hope?" Catherine asked. "If shooting starts?" "The root cellar," Stephen said. "It's carved deep into the hillside, reinforced with timber. Even if they burn the cabin, she'll be safe there. The thought of hiding her baby in a dark hole while bullets flew overhead made Catherine's stomach clench. But she forced herself to think practically. Hope's safety was the most important thing, more important than her own comfort or peace of mind. "How many men do you think he'll bring?" Catherine asked. Stephen considered the question, his expression thoughtful. "Depends on how much authority he really has, how many favors he can call in. Could be 3 or 4, could be a dozen." "Can you handle that many?" Stephen's smile was grim but confident. "I've handled worse odds with less at stake." The attack came 3 days later, just as the morning sun was painting the peaks gold and pink. Catherine was feeding hope when she heard the sound of horses, too many horses, approaching fast through the trees. "Stephen," she called softly, not wanting to wake the baby with sudden movement. He was already moving, rifle in hand, positioning himself at the window with the clear field of fire he had planned for. His movements were economical, professional, speaking of training that had become instinct. "How many?" Catherine whispered, settling hope in her cradle and moving to the position they had discussed. "6," Stephen replied, his voice calm and professional. "Cook and 5 others, more than I expected." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to think clearly. Hope needed to be protected, needed to be somewhere safe if shooting started. The root cellar Stephen had shown her, carved into the hillside behind the cabin, would have to do. "Catherine Mitchell!" Paul Cook's voice echoed off the cabin walls, amplified by the mountain air. "Come out here! This is your last chance to do this the easy way." Stephen glanced back at her, a question in his eyes. Catherine shook her head firmly. She was done with easy ones, done with surrendering to men who mistook cruelty for strength. "She's not going anywhere with you, Cook," Stephen called back, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "That's your final answer, Rogers?" "It is." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of men dismounting, spreading out to surround the cabin. Catherine could hear their boots crunching in the snow, could imagine them taking positions behind trees and rocks, preparing for a siege. "You're harboring a fugitive," Paul shouted from somewhere in the trees, "interfering with a lawful order. Come out now and maybe we can work something out." Stephen's response was to chamber a round in his rifle, the metallic sound carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. It was answer enough. The first shot shattered the morning stillness, splintering wood near Stephen's head and sending splinters flying across the cabin. He returned fire immediately, and Catherine heard a cry of pain from somewhere in the trees. The battle was joined. For the next hour, gunfire echoed through the mountains as Stephen held off 6 men with nothing but superior position and intimate knowledge of the terrain. He moved from window to window, never staying in one place long enough for them to get a clear shot, picking his targets with the precision of a trained marksman. Catherine huddled in the corner with Hope, who had somehow slept through the initial chaos but was now awake and fussing. She sang softly to her daughter, old lullabies her own mother had taught her, trying to project calm she didn't feel while keeping one eye on the back door. "Catherine," Paul's voice again, closer now, more desperate. "This doesn't have to end in blood. Just come out and talk." "Talk to this," Stephen snarled, putting a bullet close enough to Paul's position to send him scrambling for better cover. But Catherine could see what Stephen couldn't from his position. One of the attackers had worked his way around to the back of the cabin, was even now approaching the door they had left unguarded. She saw the handle turn slowly, saw the door begin to open, and acted without thinking. The cast iron skillet connected with the intruder's skull with a sound like a melon dropping, and he collapsed in the doorway, his rifle clattering across the floor. Catherine grabbed the weapon, checked to make sure it was loaded, and took position at the back window. "Behind you," she called to Stephen, who spun to see what she had done. For a moment, their eyes met across the cabin, and Catherine saw something in his expression that made her feel 10 feet tall. Pride, respect, and something deeper that made her chest tight with emotion. "Good work," he said simply, then turned back to his own shooting. The siege continued, but the balance had shifted. With Catherine covering the rear approach, Stephen could focus his attention on the main assault, and his accuracy began to tell. One by one, the attackers found their positions untenable, forced to retreat or risk being picked off by the mountain man who seemed to know exactly where they would appear. "This is taking too long." Paul's voice carried frustration and growing desperation. "We need to flush them out." Catherine saw smoke beginning to rise from multiple points around the cabin and felt her heart sink. They were trying to burn them out, force them into the open where superior numbers would tell. "Stephen!" she called. "Fire!" He had already seen it, was already calculating their options. "The root cellar," he said. "Get hope and go. Now." But Catherine shook her head. "Not without you. Catherine, if this place burns, then we burn together," she said firmly. "I'm not running anymore." By noon, the shooting had stopped, and an uneasy quiet settled over the mountain. Catherine could see movement in the trees, but the attackers seemed to have pulled back to regroup and reassess their situation. "They're not giving up," Stephen said, reloading his rifle with practiced efficiency. "What do? We wait. They have to come to us, and that gives us the advantage." But Catherine could see the strain in Stephen's face, the way his jaw was set with determination that couldn't quite hide his concern. They had limited ammunition, limited food, and a baby who would need care regardless of what was happening outside. Time was not necessarily on their side. The afternoon brought a new development, smoke rising from multiple points around the cabin. Paul Cook had decided that if he couldn't force them out with bullets, he would try fire. "They're trying to smoke us out," Stephen said grimly, watching the smoke begin to thicken around their sanctuary. Catherine looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary. At the careful craftsmanship that spoke of Stephen's years of patient work, and felt anger rise in her throat like bile. These men would destroy everything good in the world rather than admit they might be wrong. "The root cellar," she said. "How long could we hold out there?" "Days, maybe weeks if we had supplies," Stephen replied. "But hope? A baby couldn't survive in the cold, damp confines of an underground shelter, no matter how well constructed. They needed another solution, something that would end this siege before it killed them all." That's when Catherine remembered something Stephen had told her weeks ago, a detail that had seemed unimportant at the time, but now blazed in her mind like salvation. "The water rights," she said suddenly. Stephen looked at her blankly. "What?" "You said the water belongs to whoever needs it most," Catherine said, her words coming faster as the idea took shape. "But legally, who owns the spring?" Understanding dawned in Stephen's eyes like sunrise over the peaks. "The territorial government," he said slowly. "It's federal land, protected watershed. And Paul Cook is a territorial deputy, sworn to protect federal property." Stephen's grin was sharp as a blade, which means he's currently engaged in an illegal assault on federal land, endangering a protected water source. They worked quickly, Catherine keeping watch while Stephen gathered the documents he had carefully preserved from his military service, papers that proved his knowledge of territorial law and his authority to act in defense of federal property. It was a long shot, a legal technicality that might not hold up in court, but it was also their best chance. "These discharge papers," Stephen said, holding up official documents with military seals, "they show I was assigned to territorial survey duty before my court-martial. Technically, that gives me authority to protect federal resources. Will it work?" "It doesn't have to work," Stephen said. "It just has to create enough doubt to make them hesitate." When Paul Cook called for another parley, Stephen was ready. "Cook," he shouted, holding the documents where they could be seen from the tree line, "you're in violation of Federal Statute 247, endangering a protected watershed. Stand down immediately or face federal charges." The silence that followed was longer this time, and Catherine could imagine the confusion among the attackers. They had come expecting to face a simple hermit and a runaway wife, not a man who could quote territorial law from memory. "You're bluffing, Rogers," Paul finally called back, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Am I?" Stephen held up the official documents, making sure they were visible from the tree line. "These papers say I'm a duly appointed guardian of this watershed, with full authority to defend it against all threats." It was a bluff, but a masterful one. The documents were real enough, even if they didn't say exactly what Stephen claimed, and Paul Cook had no way of knowing the difference. More importantly, the legal uncertainty was enough to make the other attackers nervous. They had signed on to help retrieve a runaway wife, not to face potential federal charges. Catherine could hear heated discussions from the trees, voices raised in argument. Paul Cook's authority was being questioned by men who had begun to realize they might be on the wrong side of the law. "Think about it, boys," Stephen called out. "How much is Paul Cook paying you to risk federal prison? Because that's what you're looking at if you continue this assault." The arguments in the trees grew louder, more heated. Catherine recognized the sound of men who had lost confidence in their leader, who were beginning to calculate the personal cost of continued loyalty. The standoff stretched into the evening, but Catherine could sense the change in the atmosphere. The attackers were no longer pressing their assault, and she could hear heated discussions from their positions in the trees. Paul Cook's authority was being questioned by men who had begun to realize they might be on the wrong side of the law. "I don't like this, Paul," one voice carried clearly in the thin air. "Federal charges ain't worth whatever Thomas Mitchell is paying." "He's bluffing!" Paul's voice was shrill with desperation. "You think that mountain man knows federal law?" "He seems to know it better than you do," another voice replied, "and those papers looked real enough to me." Catherine felt a surge of hope. Stephen's gamble was working. The legal uncertainty was creating cracks in Paul's coalition, making his men question whether the fight was worth the risk. As darkness fell, Stephen made his final play. "Cook," he called, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction, "I'm giving you one chance to leave peacefully. Take your men and ride out, and we'll forget this ever happened. And if I don't, then come morning, I send word to the territorial marshal about your illegal assault on federal property, your attempted destruction of a protected watershed, and your conspiracy to violate the civil rights of a citizen under federal protection." The legal language was impressive, even if some of it was creative interpretation. More importantly, it was enough to break the resolve of men who had already spent a day being outfought by a single mountain man and his determined partner. Catherine heard the sound of horses moving away, but Paul Cook's voice carried back through the darkness one final time, thick with frustrated rage. "This isn't over, Catherine. You can't hide up here forever. Thomas won't give up, and neither will I." Catherine moved to the doorway, hope in her arms, and called back with a voice that surprised her with its strength and conviction. "I'm not hiding," she shouted, the words echoing off the mountain peaks. "I'm home." The word carried more truth than she had intended. This was home, this cabin carved from wilderness, this life built on the foundation of mutual respect and shared struggle. She was no longer the desperate woman who had collapsed beside Stephen's well. She was someone who could stand and fight for what mattered. When the last sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance, Stephen and Catherine stood together in the doorway of their cabin, looking out at the snow-covered peaks that had witnessed their transformation from strangers to partners to something deeper than either had dared hope for. "Think they'll be back?" Catherine asked, adjusting hope in her arms. "Maybe," Stephen said, his arm coming around her shoulders, "but not Paul Cook. He knows now that he can't win this fight, and his credibility is shot. Word will spread about what happened here." Catherine shifted hope in her arms, looking down at her daughter's sleeping face. The baby had slept through most of the battle, as if she understood instinctively that she was safe in this place, protected by people who would die before they let harm come to her. "What happens now?" Catherine asked. Stephen was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the mountains to Catherine's face, to the baby in her arms. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of promises made and kept. "Now we live," he said simply. "We build something worth protecting. And we protect it." The words were a promise, a declaration of intent that encompassed everything they had fought for and everything they hoped to become. Catherine felt tears on her cheeks, but they were tears of relief, of gratitude, of joy so pure it seemed to light up the darkness around them. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily now, naturally, like water from a spring. "I love you too," Stephen replied, his lips brushing against her forehead. "Both of you, my family." Spring came early that year, melting the snow and opening the roads sooner than anyone expected. But Catherine felt no urge to leave, no pull toward the world that had cast her out. The cabin in the mountains had become more than shelter. It had become the foundation of a new life built on principles that wouldn't bend to the convenience of others. Stephen had been right about the water belonging to whoever needed it most. Catherine had needed it to survive, but more than that, she had needed what it represented, the possibility of grace, of second chances, of finding family in the most unexpected places. The legal challenges Paul Cook had threatened never materialized. Word had spread through the territorial government about the deputy's failed assault on federal land, and his credibility had been damaged beyond repair. An investigation into his conduct revealed a pattern of abuse of authority that cost him his badge and his reputation. Catherine's husband had quietly filed for divorce, claiming abandonment, and she had been happy to let him have his freedom in exchange for hers. The papers arrived with a traveling merchant in late spring, along with news that Thomas Mitchell had already remarried, choosing a younger woman who would be less likely to challenge his authority. "Good riddance," Catherine said, signing the papers with a flourish that spoke of liberation rather than loss. As summer painted the mountains in shades of green and gold, Catherine and Stephen were married in a ceremony witnessed only by the peaks and the sky and the spring that had brought them together. Hope, now walking and babbling in a mixture of sounds that might have been words, seemed to approve of the arrangement, clapping her hands when they kissed and laughing at the echo that came back from the surrounding cliffs. The traveling preacher who performed the ceremony was a kind man who asked no questions about their past, only blessed their future with words that spoke of love as a force of nature, as inevitable and necessary as water flowing downhill. "Do you, Stephen Rogers, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Stephen said, his voice carrying across the mountain air like a prayer. "Do you, Catherine Mitchell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Catherine replied, and felt the last chains of her old life fall away completely. They built additions to the cabin, expanding it to accommodate their growing family. Stephen taught Catherine to hunt and fish, to read the weather and the behavior of animals, to find her way by the stars. She taught him to see beauty in small moments, to laugh at hope's attempts to catch butterflies, to believe that love could be trusted even after it had been betrayed. The well continued to provide water that was cold and sweet, better than wine, and Catherine never passed it without remembering the day she had collapsed beside it, more dead than alive, carrying a child she wasn't sure she could protect. Now Hope played beside the same well, secure in the knowledge that she was loved, that she belonged, that her mother would never again be too weak to fight for what mattered. Travelers sometimes found their way to the mountain cabin, drawn by stories of the hermit and his family who offered shelter to those in need. Catherine and Stephen always welcomed them, sharing what they had, offering the same grace that had saved Catherine's life. There was the young man fleeing a murder charge he swore he was innocent of, who stayed long enough to help with the harvest before moving on to California. The widow with 3 children whose husband had died in a mining accident, who spent the winter with them and left in spring with enough supplies to start fresh in Oregon. The former slave making his way north to Canada, who taught Hope her first songs and left with tears in his eyes and hope in his heart. "The water is theirs now," Stephen would tell each traveler, repeating the words that had become their creed, "for as long as they need it." On quiet evenings, when Hope was asleep and the fire burned low in the hearth, Catherine would sometimes think about the woman she had been before, the desperate creature who had walked 3 days through mountains with nothing but hope to sustain her. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she had known briefly but no longer recognized. The woman she had become was stronger, not because she had learned to fight, though she had, but because she had learned to believe in her own worth. She had discovered that love was not something to be earned through submission or perfection, but something that grew naturally when people chose to see the best in each other, to stand together against whatever tried to tear them apart. Stephen had been right about building something worth protecting. They had created more than a home in these mountains. They had created a sanctuary where broken people could heal, where second chances were as common as mountain springs, where the measure of a person's worth was not their past mistakes, but their willingness to keep trying. The water belonged to whoever needed it most. And Catherine had learned that sometimes what people needed most was not just water, but the faith that they deserved to drink it, that their thirst mattered, that someone would fight to ensure they never went without again. In giving that gift to others, she had finally learned to give it to herself. As winter approached again, bringing with it the promise of long nights by the fire and the quiet contentment of a life lived on their own terms, Catherine stood beside the well that had saved her life and looked up at the stars scattered across the mountain sky. Hope was in Stephen's arms, pointing at the lights and making sounds that might have been wonder, and Catherine felt the kind of peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. The mountain had taught her many things, but perhaps the most important was this, that home was not a place you were born to or a destination you traveled toward, but something you built with your own hands, something you defended with your own courage, something you shared with people who understood that the best things in life were worth fighting for. The water was hers now, in Hope's and Stephen's, and anyone else who needed it enough to climb the mountain and ask. It would always be there, cold and sweet and life-giving, a reminder that grace could be found in the most unexpected places, that love could bloom in the harshest soil, and that sometimes the end of one story was really just the beginning of another. Years would pass, and Hope would grow into a young woman as strong and determined as her mother, as principled and courageous as the man who raised her. She would learn to shoot straight and think clearly, to offer hospitality to strangers and stand firm against injustice. And when her own time came to choose between safety and principle, between comfort and courage, she would remember the stories her parents told her about the well that saved them all, about the water that belonged to whoever needed it most. But that is a story for another day. For now, it was enough that Catherine Rogers stood beside her husband and daughter, watching the stars wheel overhead, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that some things, love, family, justice, mercy, were worth any price demanded of them. The water flowed on, as it always had, as it always would, carrying with it the promise of life renewed, of hope reborn, of grace freely given to all who had the courage to drink deeply and the wisdom to share what they had received.